Being back in the perspective of not knowing what it was that controlled heredity, and given what you know already about these molecules and what they do and how they act, why might you sort of intuit that, hey, maybe it's protein that's controlling all this stuff? Like, what's an idea? I heard a few people coming up with some ideas. You guys had it.
Amino acids, and the way that there's a lot of different functions for them. So this is not a function.
It's like structure and movement, and they catalyze reactions and everything. So it just has a lot of variety of different uses in the body. So if it's making so many things, it would just make sense that it created.
Okay, so proteins, we know, are able to do all of these wondrous things for the body. We talked in great detail about enzymes and enzyme-catalyzed reactions, and we talked about how there are those things called amino acids that are polymerized into proteins, and the shape of the protein determines sort of what it does. And because there's so many different amino acids and so many combinations and so many shapes, proteins are able to do a really incredible, diverse array of activities and reactions within the body. Right? And just to even make it more simple, how many amino acids are there? 21 amino acids, if you count selenocysteine. What about DNA? What are the base units of DNA? What are the monomers that make up the DNA polymer? There's 4 of them, and they're called nucleotides. And we know, because we've already talked about DNA and its structure, that the DNA itself doesn't have sort of the same complexity of form that proteins are able to take. So DNA is much simpler in structure. It's composed of 4 nucleotides or monomers. Proteins, big, complex, do lots of stuff for the body, make things happen, right? And there's 21 amino acids that get polymerized into these protein chains. So a lot of people, at the time, they knew that both protein and DNA were in the right place within the cell, the part that contained the heritable material, but they didn't know which one it was. And so there were people who felt it was proteins, and there were people who felt it was probably DNA. And so when you think about it, and it's a really simplistic and false argument to make, but if you were to try to create a complex language out of letters, and you chose a language that was based on an alphabet that had 4 letters, versus an alphabet that was based on a language based on an alphabet that had 21 letters, you would think that, well, there's so many more possible combinations for the 21-letter language than the 4-letter language that, of course, you would encode information with the 21-letter language, right? Yeah.
But didn't they still have that theory that the simplest spot, was that before, actually, I'm asking now, is that before or after the time where science sort of developed that idea that the simplest solution might end up being the right one? Because I feel like, just sort of the way science seems to go, and what I've been learning, that I've sort of learned that sometimes most of the time, as a matter of fact, like in the evolutionary trees, where you don't necessarily assume that they de-evolved it and re-evolved it back again. You would assume the simplest solution. So wouldn't that kind of point scientists in the direction of DNA, being as it's
Sure. So one thing you could say, well, it's simpler, it's fewer. Maybe the simplest possible language would be the most logical one, like Occam's razor, like we talked about with. Sure, Tyler.
But then we could also make the argument that it would be simpler to make a complex language from 21 letters than it would be from 4 letters.
Sure.
So both do have like a very valiant argument, I would say. And I mean, I was just kind of thinking back, like if say like we just observe from an external standpoint, and we see that heart failure runs in a family, then not knowing that DNA is the true answer, we can almost argue that because proteins make or carry out a lot of biological processes within the body, that obviously they're getting core protein function as a heritable trait.
Sure. So if we extend the idea that proteins do everything in the body, and if there are diseases that are inheritable that are based on dysfunction of some protein, well, isn't that sort of a connection right there that shows us it's protein and not something else? that underlies heredity. So there's lots of different ways to sort of think about it. The idea that because it's a sort of more complex language, that it makes more sense, we all know in the modern era is that doesn't make any sense at all, because we're able to encode the entire, alphabet of 26 letters in a binary system, right? Ones and zeros, which is how all information is encoded in computers. So you really aren't limited in terms of the complexity by how many units make up the language. All right. Now, we're going to walk through a few experiments, and I'm going to ask you guys, after I introduce the experiment, to interpret the data that I give you up here or on this sheet. Okay? So you guys will have to discuss and interpret these data in order to sort of come to the same realization that scientists did when they saw these results. So we're going to walk through these experiments today. We're going to talk about the Griffith experiment. And these are all just named after the scientist who kind of led the team to these discoveries. So we're going to first talk about the Griffith experiment, which discovered that there is some mysterious transforming principle that's able to carry information between living organisms. Right? We're then going to extend that to this Avery experiment, where they narrowed in on it being likely it was probably DNA as opposed to one of the other macromolecules that actually carried the ability to transform and contain information. And then we'll talk about the Hershey-Chase experiment, which is a kind of a weird, a little bit complicated experiment. We're going to have to explain a bit to make sure you guys sort of get how it's working, that use these weird things called bacteriophages that are viruses of bacteria, to kind of further explore the question of, is it protein or is it DNA that actually carries heritable information? And by the way, these are all going through either bacteria or viruses of bacteria, because they're simple systems to work in. And then the extension of that is, if it works in these systems, it probably works in all living things. Then we'll talk about the Watson-Crick, Wilkins and Franklin situation, let's just call it that you guys watched the video about for today. And the discovery of the structure of DNA. And then, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but there's an experiment that's a really cool and elegant experiment that demonstrated the way in which DNA is copied. So there's a few different ways DNA could be replicated, and this one experiment figured it out. Are you ready for the grand tour? Okay. Hooray.